Hello, so fourth time lucky, I'm going to make a revision video on Aristotle. Aristotle was an ancient Greek philosopher. He was, well, Plato was his teacher, so he was a student of Plato, and Socrates was the teacher of Plato. Um, so I'll go into the differences between Aristotle and Plato real quick. So Plato was a rationalist, meaning the highest truth he perceived was in the mind. We could only reach truth through psychological endeavours or endeavours of the soul, but there's really not much distinction between the mind and the soul according to Plato. They were essentially the same thing. And he demonstrates this through a charioteer analogy, whereby the charioteer is the rational mind or the soul, and the charioteer has to keep the black and the white horse in check, which is the appetitive part of the soul and the spirited part of the soul. So it's emotions and appetite essentially. And these are our bodily desires, and these they drag us down and keep us grounded in the material world, which according to Plato isn't real. The material world is just composed of copies of the forms, and the forms exist in the realm of the forms, which is some sort of metaphysical place, perhaps. It's not made of matter, because according to Plato, matter is inherently flawed, and I guess you could make a case for the problem of evil with this. If matter is inherently flawed, and everything in the world is made out of matter, or everything tangible is made of matter, then we can't escape imperfection within the material world. Therefore, there is going to be evil, and there's going to be suffering, and there's going to be things constantly going wrong because it's all matter. So can we really blame God for that? Perhaps not. Well, Plato had a different definition of God actually. Well, he obviously didn't believe in the Christian God because he came before Christ, but he believed in a sort of demiurge, I believe it was called, and this was a god. It was sort of like a prime mover, but a bit different. It was a god who existed amongst the other gods. It was like the ultimate being who created the world out of pre-existent matter which already existed in the universe. And obviously the questions are, how did the matter get there? And it's like, well, Plato would probably say the matter has just always been there. It's just a blunt fact, or a brute fact, as Bertrand Russell would say. The universe is just a brute fact. But Bertrand Russell wouldn't go as far to say that a god reordered that matter. It was just the nature of the universe has literally created itself. And we shouldn't necessarily be asking how that happened, or why that happened. Perhaps ask how, but not why. Because how can be explained through science, but why, it's like, well, that's a little bit more complicated, I guess. But I don't know. Maybe that is a question for science, and I'm missing the point. Um. So yeah. Plato believed that the highest form was the form of the good, essentially, and this is represented in his cave allegory as the sun. So there's three prisoners in a cave. There's three prisoners in a cave. They're sat with their heads chained facing forward. They've got their arms chained up. They've got their legs chained up, so they can't look anywhere but to the wall directly in front of them, which is at the back of the cave. Behind them are some men. These men, and there's a fire, and also some objects. So the men are using the objects, putting them in front of the fire, and this is casting shadows onto the wall in front of the three prisoners. Now, because the three prisoners can't see the objects behind them, which is essentially more real than the shadows which are being cast onto the wall, I guess you could compare the objects to the forms, perhaps. They assume that the shadows of the objects are the most real thing, are the only real thing, in fact, because they can't conceptualize anything else. One day, one of the prisoners, he's dragged up out of the cave, so well, I guess he would be dragged because he would be, because his current reality, that's what he knows about the world, and if you're being taken out of that, it's like entering chaos. It's like entering a place that you've never been before. It's completely shaken up your belief system, so you wouldn't necessarily want to go completely willingly. you would be reluctant to do that. So that's I guess why it says dragged. And anyway, he goes up, exits the cave, and he stood there, and it's like, well, he can barely see at first. He's blinded by the light. He's blinded by the form of the good, which is the sun. So he's looking around. He can see all this landscape. He can see the sun in the sky, and it takes his eyes ages to readjust. And it's like he eventually realizes that there's something more real than what he thought was real in the first place. And for Plato, this place is essentially the realm of the forms. This is where all the realist things happen. And when the man is dragged back, well, I can't remember if he's dragged back down into the cave, but he's taken back down to the cave. He's put back in his old position. He's chained with his head forward, and he tries to educate the other men. He says, look, what you're seeing in front of you isn't necessarily all there is with life. That's not all there is to life. All you're seeing is a bunch of shadows. You're not actually seeing reality. You're just seeing a copy of reality, or a copy of reality. And the men, they're so ignorant and so stuck in their own ways because they've never exited outside of their own domain of comfort through no fault of their own. They've never had an opportunity to do so. But because that's all they're seeing, they're extremely... they think basically that the fact that the other man got released and has gone out there, it's tapped his mind, it's made him crazy. So now he's got a distorted view of reality and he's just insane. And they said that if we ever escape from here, we'll try to kill you. So I guess you could link this to religious experience. It's like if someone has a mystical experience and they come back down to, well, they obviously have to be able to function in the world after it. It's very difficult to talk about those situations because no one really understands that it will sound like you're going insane if you say that you had an experience which took you completely outside of the realm of what you're used to experiencing and what everyone's used to experiencing. It's not going to be taken too easily by people. They're going to be quite objected to it. But you know the truth, and you knew it happened to you, and I guess that could make you feel a little bit depressed and outcast because you can't relate to people in the same way you once could. So anyway, that's Plato's cave story. So Plato believes that there's no reality to the material world. The only reality is the reality of the form. The material world almost captures the essence of the form, but it's not the actual form itself. So if we think about forms, now this is quite a complicated idea. I've done a little bit of I don't know what to call it. I guess it's revision, but not. It's like it's researching into what Plato thought of forms, and I think a good way to think of it is like ideas or ideals. And one thing I can't help but link it to is sort of a Jungian archetype. It's like the ideal situation, but an archetype. So Plato said there's forms for everything, but it doesn't really mention forms for bad things, and I guess that's because the forms are perfect, and why would you want a perfect bad thing? That seems like a contradiction in terms. So, but there's forms for ways of life almost. So there's the form of the father, the form of the mother, the form of a pen, the form of a TV, the form of a rock, and everything in the material world is just copying that. But it's sort of the metaphysical ones that I'm thinking of, like the form of actions. So I guess the form of a father isn't necessarily the form of a shape of a man, although that's probably encompassed in it. It's like it's the form of how the father should act in accordance with promoting a healthy and happy child, or a child who can be well integrated into society. And it's undeniable that some ways of parenting are better than others, and perhaps all of these ways of parenting are trying to get at this one ideal. If there wasn't, well, I remember hearing Jordan Peterson explain this quite nicely actually. He says that the ideal, or the hero, is essentially, we take all the different hero stories from all the different mythologies, we take out their best aspects, or this could be from humanity, we take out all the best aspects of humanity, and then we create one being with all those different aspects, which encompasses and embodies all those different positive aspects, and that is essentially the ideal that we're aiming towards, and that could essentially be God. So, and that does link to archetypes as well, but there isn't archetypes for physical objects like Plato said there is an archetype of pens or an archetype of dogs, not archetype forms. There's a difference. Forms of dogs, forms of rocks, and material things copy them, but it's definitely the form of an action or the form of an emotion or the form of a way of being is definitely very similar to the form of an archetype or an archetype, which is essentially an ideal way of being in the world, I guess, is a good way to look at an archetype. Yeah, so okay, so I'll move on to Aristotle now, actually, because I've done quite a bit of explaining on Plato, and I wasn't even intending to make this video on Plato. So Aristotle was an empiricist, so he believed that we could derive truth from sense experience, from looking at the world around us and observing it. And for this reason, Aristotle is compared to a scientist, but he's not a scientist. He does care about truth, but he's not a scientist because, well, as we know now, well, science didn't come about until around 500 years ago, proper science anyway. So, and Aristotle didn't necessarily perform tests. He went out and he observed things, but I wouldn't say that he went out, he got groups of people and he created a sample and he went through the whole scientific process of forming an hypothesis and then deriving conclusions that way. He just thought it was based on sense experience. He thought we could go out, look at the world and derive truth from the material world that way. And I guess in a sense he thought that the form of... Oh, I can't remember. I remember hearing something about Aristotle saying that the truth is within the material world, whereas Plato said that that the only real truth is abstracted from the material world. But I feel like I know more about Plato on this than I do about Aristotle because I've done more revision on Plato for some reason. But I think Aristotle's view about the fact that there is truth, that truth lies in the material world, is much more valid than Plato's, because Plato doesn't have any proof for his realm of the forms, this idea that there is this metaphysical or abstract realm whereby everything exists as an ideal form which isn't even physical, and everything just copies off that. There's absolutely no proof for that whatsoever. It's just completely speculative. Although I do think there is some truth to it, but there's a difference between some truth and all truth. Whereas Aristotle, he does take into account the material world, and the material world is essentially what we're living in now. So we can be certain that it does have some truth to it. Descartes has just crossed my mind, and he obviously doubts that we can be certain about the material world because, well, the only thing we can certain about is the fact that we're a conscious thinking being, and that led him to say, is it cogito ergo sum, which is essentially I think therefore I am, but it's better translated as I'm conscious therefore I am. I am a conscious thinking rational being, therefore I am. Because you can't deny the fact that you're thinking without thinking about that. So the process of which you can't deny the process of which you're using to deny. If that makes sense, and I think it does. But anyway, we do have to assume that the material world is here because, well, I think it would be solipsistic not to. We seem to be having an experience and it seems to have meaning. Other people seem to be affected by the actions that we take. We seem to be affected by the actions other people take. And we're interacting in a way that it's not completely meaningless. And like Plato would say, it's not completely unreal. But then again, I guess Plato would say that it's really our minds and it's really our souls that are interacting. And our bodies is just the machine which allows us to do that. And anyway, I'm going to go back to Descartes a minute, because Descartes did... I think people have this conception about Descartes that he was a dualist, and that he believed that people have a separate mind and a separate body. he did say that the mind is different in a way, distinct from the body in that it doesn't extend. It's not. It doesn't take up space, essentially. But the body does. Um, so my hand is taking up room in space, whereas my mind is not. And you can argue that is the mind just reducible down to a material substrate, and that's an argument you could make. And if you're going to make that argument, then you could say that the mind does take up space. But I don't want to think about that too much because I will probably lose my mind a little bit. But I don't know. I can't really comment on that. I don't know if the mind does take up space, because I think consciousness is a complex thing. Though after 500 years of scientific endeavour, that's one thing that we still don't know barely anything about. So I don't feel comfortable jumping to any sort of concrete conclusions about that. I think anyone would be dumb to do that. Especially if you're not qualified in the matter. But so I won't speculate about that too much. Anyway, I'm really just jumping around what Aristotle talked about because to be honest, I don't really know. So I guess this is a sign that I need to do some more revision on Aristotle. I know that Aristotle talked about the four causes. So these were I can't remember the first one. Okay, I'm going to say the three that I can remember: the formal, efficient, and final. One minute. Okay, yeah, I can't remember what that is, but I'll make a. I'm gonna end the video there anyway because it's like nearly 18 minutes long. So I'll make a separate video about the four causes. I know now that I need to do a little bit more revision on Aristotle, and I've probably got a lot of other topics that I'm gonna feel like this about, and yeah, it's okay. Right, thanks for watching.